Imagine the sheer precision needed to perfectly align tiny fragments of bone deep inside someone's body.
Mhm.
Now think about the thousands of hours of really focused practice for an athlete to shave maybe just fractions of a second off their best time.
Right. Two very different kinds of focus.
But what if those two worlds, orthopedic surgery and, elite athletic performance, what if they're not actually that far apart?
Well, fundamentally, they're both about understanding the incredible mechanics of the human body, aren't they?
Mm.
Pushing limits and
Yeah.
stepping in when things go wrong.
And then you add in the huge, complex business side of modern sport,
Mhm.
plus the ethics involved in both caring for people and running that industry.
Well, it's a pretty fascinating landscape to explore. Welcome back to the deep dive.
So we've taken that stack of sources you sent over, covering everything from the latest in fixing really severe injuries, patient recovery,
Yeah.
to the science behind peak performance, the whole sports business world, and even the ethical challenges. And we've tried to distill it down. Our aim really is to cut through all the noise, give you the key insights, and help you get properly informed on these, well, seemingly separate topics that actually connect in surprising ways. Ready to dive in?
Absolutely. There's quite a bit here.
Okay, let's kick off with some quick thoughts just based on the material. When we look at top athletes, is their performance mostly about being born with the right stuff? Or is it just sheer hard work?
The sources really lean towards it being a complex mix. I mean, talent gives you a head start, maybe, but that dedicated, specific practice, that's where excellence is really forged.
And how much is technology changing the surgeon's job, especially in those really complex procedures like fixing a major fracture?
It's becoming pretty indispensable, actually. You're looking at greater precision, sometimes less risk, definitely helping surgeons see things they couldn't before.
Okay. And stepping back a bit, away from the field, away from the clinic, what's really driving the engine of the modern sports industry? What's behind it all?
It's a huge business, multi-billion dollar, built on massive media deals, intricate sponsorships, complex logistics around facilities, and increasingly a heavy reliance on data.
Fascinating. Okay, let's maybe start with the medical side first, using those orthopedic trauma sources. One thing that really stood out was this shift in how medical research is structured and, what outcomes are being prioritized now.
Exactly. You've got these established frameworks like PICU that helps researchers clearly define the population, the intervention, the comparison, and the outcomes.
Right.
It's sort of the backbone for designing a good clinical study. And alongside that, you see things like classification systems for spine injuries, for example. They're constantly being updated as our understanding improves.
And the focus isn't just on whether the x-ray looks good anymore.
No, not at all. There's a huge move towards patient-reported outcomes, really asking patients directly about their function, their pain, quality of life.
How they feel.
Precisely. Using tools that are getting smarter, more dynamic, almost adapting to the patient's answers, using things like computer adaptive testing.
Yeah.
It's about capturing the patient's actual experience.
Okay, so frameworks for studies, better ways to measure outcomes.
Mhm.
But let's get into the surgery itself. Technology is clearly changing techniques.
Absolutely. For things like inserting the guide wires for screws that lock intramedullary, nails those rods inside the bone,
Yeah.
technologies like electromagnetic targeting systems are being used. The promise there, according to some studies anyway, is faster procedures and less radiation exposure.
For everyone involved.
Yeah, for the patient and the surgical team compared to the older methods that just rely on X-ray guidance, fluoroscopy.
And less invasive approaches seem to be a recurring theme, too.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
For certain injuries like complex ankle fractures, pylon fractures, or some pelvic ring injuries, there are techniques and implants being developed that need smaller incisions.
And the goal there is,
Well, the goal is to reduce the damage to the surrounding muscles and tissues, which, can potentially help with recovery.
now, a really core principle in fixing any broken bone is getting the pieces back into the right position first. The sources were very clear on that fixing comes after you get alignment.
This is, you could argue, the most critical step,
Mm.
especially in really complex fractures like the pelvis. You absolutely must get accurate reduction, lining the bone ends up correctly before you try and fix it rigidly.
Because otherwise,
Trying to fix a bone that's not properly aligned is just, well, it's a recipe for long-term problems, pain, arthritis, failure of the fixation.
and getting that reduction, especially in something like the pelvis, sounds incredibly difficult.
It certainly can be. The sources describe a whole range of techniques, from relatively simple things like just positioning the patient correctly on the table or using
Yeah.
manual pressure.
Pushing on it.
Yeah, or even wrapping a sheet around the pelvis and pulling, kind of like a tourniquet but for alignment. Then there are more complex percutaneous methods, using wires or special screws through small skin incisions to manipulate fragments.
And sometimes even that's not enough.
Right, sometimes you just have to do a full open surgery if the bones are too displaced or trapped. Each approach has its place, but the goal is always the same. Restore the anatomy as accurately as possible.
Okay, so once you have the alignment, the choice of implant the plates, the screws, the nails, it isn't just about holding things still, is it? It actually influences how the bone heals.
That's a really key insight. The hardware you choose dictates the mechanical environment around the fracture. So for instance, standard locking plates are very, very rigid.
Each sounds good.
It is good for stability, especially in weak osteoporotic bone. But sometimes, particularly if you're breaking a very fragmented fracture, that extreme rigidity can actually be too much. It might slow down the natural healing process, which often involves some micro movement and callus formation.
Ah, okay. So concepts like far cortical locking or dynamic locking are those attempts to find a balance.
Precisely. These are either methods or specific implant designs that allow a tiny controlled amount of movement along the bone's axis while still keeping everything aligned and stable.
So stability, but with a little give.
Exactly. Enough stability to hold it right, but enough flexibility to encourage the bone's own healing mechanisms. Intramedullary nails, the rods inside the bone, are also very good at allowing that kind of axial compression, which helps healing, while still being very stable against bending or twisting.
Beyond just fixing the bone, trauma care involves managing the patient's whole condition, and complications can be really severe.
Oh, absolutely. A major concern highlighted in the sources is venous thromboembolism, VTE basically, blood clots.
Right.
The sources mention some pretty worrying rates of fatal pulmonary embolism, which is a clot traveling to the lungs. It can range anywhere from 1% up to maybe 13% after major orthopedic surgery.
Wow, that's a significant risk. How is that being managed?
Well, the guidelines seem to be moving towards a more personalized approach.
Right.
So, assessing each patient's individual risk factors
Yeah.
rather than just a standard prevention protocol for everyone.
Makes sense.
And research is looking at different medications too. There was a study mentioned comparing rivaroxaban, which is an oral anticoagulant tablet, to the more traditional injectable LMWH, low molecular weight heparin.
Mm-hmm.
And it found rivaroxaban significantly lowered the overall rate of VTE without increasing bleeding problems. That could be quite important.
The sources also touched on what happens if the bone doesn't heal correctly.
Yeah, non-unions where the fracture just doesn't heal at all, they can be really tricky, especially if there's an infection involved as well.
And malunions?
Malunions are where it heals, but in the wrong position, deformed. Fixing those requires very careful planning. The sources mentioned using geometric principles like the core ara, the center of rotation of angulation.
Okay.
It's crucial for planning corrective cuts, osteotomies, to basically re-break and realign the bone without creating new problems.
And are there studies looking at ways to boost healing or fight infection right at the site?
Right. For instance, one study compared a bioabsorbable gel that delivered antibiotics directly into an open fracture site against the older method using antibiotic-loaded cement beads.
And
The gel showed some promise, suggested maybe better local delivery, potentially fewer infections, at least in that particular research model. It still needs more investigation, of course.
some injuries just sound particularly nasty, like fractures around the hip socket, the acetabulum.
Oh, they're notoriously difficult. The anatomy's complex. It's a major weight-bearing joint. The sources note that even seemingly small broken pieces from the back wall of the socket can make the hip unstable.
And you can't always tell from an x-ray.
Exactly. Relying just on imaging can be misleading. Often, the best way to really know if it's stable is to examine the hip under anesthesia in the operating theater. And unfortunately, long-term problems like post-traumatic arthritis are pretty common after these injuries.
And there was that surprising finding about a technique used to control severe bleeding in pelvic injuries.
Yes, this is where it gets really interesting and frankly raises more questions. One study found a surprisingly high rate of deep infection, over 50% in patients who had pre-surgical angioembolization.
That's the procedure to block bleeding vessels.
Correct. To control pelvic hemorrhage before surgery. You wouldn't intuitively expect that procedure to lead to more infection later on. It really highlights an area needing more research to figure out that connection.
Moving beyond individual patients now, the sources also drew lessons from really big events.
Yes, mass casualty events like the Boston Marathon bombing or the Haiti earthquake response. They really underscore the absolute need for detailed pre-event planning, running drills, having a rapid coordinated ambulance response, and ensuring you have flexible staffing arrangements.
And identifying the pitfalls, too, presumably.
Oh, yes. Things like credentialing volunteers quickly and effectively, making sure people who show up to help are actually used in roles that match their skills,
Yeah.
especially under immense pressure. Those were flagged as significant barriers.
And managing patients with multiple severe injuries, polytrauma, that sounds like a huge organizational challenge, as well as medical.
It absolutely is. It demands highly collaborative care across many different specialties, all working together simultaneously. A key debate in trauma surgery for years has been about the timing of fixing the broken bones.
Right, the damage control orthopedics idea.
Exactly. Quick, temporary fixation for really unstable patients, that was popular. But more recent thinking, backed by some evidence, suggests that getting to definitive fixation, the final fix, within about 36 hours is often best, provided the patient has been properly resuscitated first.
So it's a balance.
It's a balance, weighing the benefits of early stability against the physiological hit of very long surgery on an already injured patient.
And they use scoring systems to try and quantify how severe things are.
Yes, various scores exist, anatomical ones like the Injury Severity Score, ISS, physiological ones like the Revised Trauma Score, RTS, and predictive models like the Trauma Mortality Prediction Model, TMPM.
Are they useful?
They're useful tools, definitely. For research, comparing outcomes between centers, maybe helping with triage decisions, but they all have limitations in predicting exactly what will happen to any single individual patient.
Okay, that's a really thorough look at the medical side. Let's shift gears completely now and look at the science of creating peak performance, drawing from that sports gene material. The big question here seems to be nature versus nurture for elite athletes.
Yeah, the classic debate. And the source argues pretty strongly it's not really an either-or situation, while it acknowledges people like Erickson, who champion the idea that it's all about accumulated deliberate practice.
The 10,000 hours rule everyone talks about.
Exactly, often simplified to that rule.
Yeah.
The source pushes back quite hard against that being the whole story.
How so?
It introduces this really interesting concept of sports acting as powerful selective pressures, leading to incredibly specialized body types over time. The phrase used is galaxies hurtling apart, meaning elite athletes in different sports are becoming physically more distinct. Think about how elite distance runners today are often smaller, quite slight, while volleyball players or American football linemen are getting dramatically bigger and taller. The demands of the sport effectively select for certain physical traits.
Wow.
It even cites statistics like how much more likely very tall women are to make an Olympic final in certain sports compared to shorter women. It's quite stark.
So the environment of the sport itself shapes who succeeds based on their physical makeup. But what about genetics itself, being born with specific athlete genes?
The source is pretty realistic here. It cautions against thinking we'll find a single athlete gene. The human genome is incredibly complex.
Right.
And the same athletic outcomes, say speed or endurance, can probably be achieved through many different genetic pathways, sometimes involving private mutations, unique to specific families or lineages.
But genetics does play a role. It's not irrelevant.
Well, absolutely it plays a role. Research into genes like myostatin and follistatin, which influence muscle growth, is mentioned. That highlights both the basic science and potentially therapeutic applications down the line for muscle-wasting conditions. It's about understanding the genetic influences within that complex mix, not finding one silver bullet gene.
What about those classic examples people always bring up, like the dominance of Jamaican sprinters or Kenyan distance runners?
The source discusses the convenient story, linking genetic factors in Jamaican sprinters back to the Maroons, descendants of escaped slaves, known for their resilience and speed. It notes top sprinters often come from that specific region, but it also contrasts the success of Kalenjin runners from Kenya in endurance events with their relative lack of dominance in sprinting. It suggests different factors, whether genetic or environmental or both, are likely at play for different types of running performance.
They also brought up some very specific, almost surprising skills that turn out to be crucial.
Yes. What's fascinating there is the discussion about visual acuity in baseball batting. It's not just about raw reaction time.
It's about seeing better.
It's about being able to pick up tiny visual cues like the rotation of the baseball or seeing the seams much earlier. Better visual skills mean a batter can recognize the pitch type significantly sooner, maybe 5-10 feet closer to the pitcher, which gives them way more time to react. It's a huge advantage.
And the source looked at biological differences, too, like the throwing gap between sexes, even when training is sort of equalized.
Yes, there was a study comparing Aboriginal Australian girls who were trained from a young age in throwing for hunting and combat,
Okay.
comparing them to American girls. The training significantly closed the gap in throwing speed and accuracy. However, a biological difference still remained, even when the Aboriginal girls were actually physically larger due to maturing earlier.
So what does that tell us?
It really highlights that both nature and nurture are powerful forces. Training matters, culture matters. But biology still seems to set certain parameters, or at least influence the starting point.
The heritage study on trainability sounds like another key piece here.
That was a big study looking at how people's aerobic capacity, their VO2 max, improved with exercise training. And it found huge variation between individuals, partly influenced by genetics. Some people were high responders, some low responders.
But did everyone benefit?
That's the critical takeaway, the one often missed. Everyone in the study, regardless of how much their aerobic fitness number improved, still gained significant health benefits from the exercise. Better blood pressure, cholesterol, insulin sensitivity.
That's important.
Very important. It reinforces that while maybe peak performance has genetic ceilings for some, the health benefits from being active are accessible to pretty much everyone. It also noted variability in things like how people respond to altitude training, even within the same ethnic groups.
So whether we're talking about performance or pain tolerance or even something basic like height, the sources consistently frame it as this complex braid of genetics and environment.
That seems to be the overarching conclusion, yes. It's not genes or environment. It's genes and environment interacting in incredibly complex, dynamic ways. The early hope of finding a simple athlete gene was probably, an oversimplification of how human traits actually develop.
Okay, so we've explored the science of healing bodies and pushing bodies to their absolute limits. Now, let's try and connect these threads by looking at the massive business that underlies modern sport and how these different worlds intersect.
Right, the sports industry itself is a huge, sophisticated machine. And the sources give a pretty good overview of its structure and, crucially, where the money flows.
And it flows differently depending on the league, right?
Exactly. Leagues generate revenue primarily from national, even international sources, those massive TV contracts, league-wide sponsorships,
Right.
licensing deals for merchandise. Teams, on the other hand, tend to rely more heavily on local revenue streams. Regional broadcasting rights, ticket sales, what they make inside the stadium concessions, local sponsorships.
And that difference matters.
It matters hugely. This disparity in the size and wealth of local markets, combined with different rules about revenue sharing and salary caps between leagues, think Major League Baseball with less sharing and no hard cap versus the NFL's system. It creates significant variations in financial power between teams, and that directly impacts competitive balance or lack thereof.
The history of sports business actually goes back further than maybe many people realize.
Yes, the sources point to some early examples, like thoroughbred racing clubs in England way back in the mid-18th century. They adopted organizational structures, ways of managing things that actually resemble modern sports management quite closely, long before many of today's popular sports leagues even existed.
Marketing, obviously, is critical to this whole business.
Oh, absolutely. Sport marketing is essentially about identifying and meeting consumer needs within the sports context. That could be through products, services, events, even leveraging volunteers. It's promoting the sport itself, the teams, the athletes, and using all those promotional tools like sponsorships and endorsements.
And corporate sponsorships aren't just simple logo placements anymore. They sound incredibly complex.
They're far more than just putting a logo on a shirt or a stadium wall now. These agreements involve really intricate details. Category exclusivity being the official soft drink or official airline. The rights to use logos and team intellectual property, naming rights for venues or specific events, extensive signage and promotional assets within stadiums, digital rights across websites and social media, and often negotiated access to players for appearances or ad campaigns. It's a big package.
Broadcasting has clearly been a massive driver of the industry's growth over the years.
Hugely important. Pioneers like Rooney Arledge at ABC Sports are credited with transforming sports broadcasting. They integrated entertainment elements, things we take for granted now, like instant replay, multiple camera angles, sophisticated graphics, making sports a prime-time television spectacle.
Which paved the way for.
Paved the way for dedicated 24/7 sports networks like ESPN, which completely changed the landscape again.
But technology is now maybe fragmenting that audience, making it harder.
It is, yeah. The sources note these challenges. The sheer number of channels now. Niche sports content finding its own audience online, skinny bundles offered by streaming services where you pick and choose channels, people cutting the cord entirely from traditional cable.
Right.
Consumers just have so many more choices.
Yeah.
It makes it harder and more expensive for traditional broadcasters to capture those huge mass audiences they once relied on. The industry is constantly having to adapt.
Facility management and financing also seems like a whole world in itself, building and running these massive stadiums and arenas.
It really is. Team owners, historically, learned they could leverage host cities to help fund stadium construction, leading to eras of largely publicly financed venues. Remember those cookie-cutter stadiums?
Yeah,
The trend now often involves really complex mixes of private and public funding. The example of U.S. Bank Stadium in Minneapolis is mentioned contributions from the state, the city, the team owner, plus significant revenue streams like selling the naming rights.
And the facility managers have a tricky job.
Yeah, they had to balance generating revenue for the venue itself, concerts, other events, with the needs and the revenue streams of the main tenant teams who play there week in, week out.
Managing all these different relationships and deals, is that where agencies come into play?
Absolutely. Sport marketing and event management agencies are crucial. They range from massive full-service global firms like WMEMG or Octagon, who might represent top athletes, manage huge international events, produce TV content, the works, down to smaller, specialized agencies focusing on maybe one sport or one type of service, or even in-house marketing teams within leagues or individual teams. They provide a vast array of services essential to keeping the whole business running.
And athlete agents specifically, they seem pretty much non-negotiable now for top players.
Well, entirely necessary. With athlete salaries exploding over the last few decades and contracts becoming incredibly complex because of things like salary caps, luxury taxes, performance bonuses, agents provide absolutely crucial expertise.
More than just negotiating the salary.
Much more. They handle the contract negotiation, yes, but also often provide financial planning, tax advice, marketing opportunities, and basically level the playing field for the athlete when they're negotiating against sophisticated team front offices. Their fees are usually regulated by the players' associations, too.
The sources even drill down into specific niches, like the golf industry facing challenges.
Yeah, it faces some unique headwinds. Things like declining participation rates among certain key demographics, changing lifestyle preferences, people maybe having less free time for a 4 or 5 hour round of golf.
So what's the industry doing?
It's pushing the industry leaders to really rethink their business models, launch new initiatives specifically aimed at attracting new players, different demographics, maybe faster formats of the game, trying to adapt.
And underlying all of this, from player performance on the field to business decisions in the boardroom, is the increasing role of data.
Data analytics is just paramount now. It's used everywhere for gaining a competitive edge. Player evaluation, in-game strategy, measuring marketing effectiveness, setting ticket prices, even optimizing stadium operations.
And the skills needed are specific.
Yes, the sources highlight valuable skills for careers in this area. Strong statistical abilities, obviously, proficiency with relevant software tools, but also the ability to visualize complex data and, crucially, communicate the findings effectively to coaches or executives who might not be data experts themselves.
Finally, underpinning how everyone operates or should operate in this whole industry are ethical considerations.
Yes, ethics. Basically, the study of values and how those values guide our decision-making. The sources point out that different roles within sport can sometimes have conflicting ethical demands.
Like what?
Well, a media relations professional, for example, needs to value honesty, but also loyalty to the team or organization they represent. Navigating those kind of conflicts thoughtfully is key.
And there can be really severe failures when ethics break down completely.
Unfortunately, yes. The sources reference difficult, high-profile cases like the Jerry Sandusky scandal at Penn State, not just focusing on the horrific criminal aspects, but using it to highlight the catastrophic ethical failures in leadership and administration, the failure to report known misconduct over a long period that allowed such a situation to develop and persist. It's a really stark reminder of the responsibility that comes with positions of authority in sport.
This brings us full circle, almost, back to the medical side, but looking towards the future. The sources present a the truly thought-provoking, maybe even slightly unsettling idea about the future of sports medicine itself.
Yes. One source speculates about a future where artificial intelligence, AI, plays a really dominant role, potentially even reducing human surgeons to the role of, quote, manual technicians.
Because the AI would make the decisions.
Because the AI might become better at processing all the vast amounts of patient data, predicting surgical outcomes with greater accuracy, and selecting the absolute optimal treatment strategy for that individual.
Drawing an analogy to autonomous vehicles, maybe eventually replacing human drivers.
Exactly that analogy.
Yeah.
The idea is that increased accuracy, efficiency, maybe even safety in predicting the best outcome could drive a shift towards AI-guided decision-making and surgical planning, and perhaps even execution eventually.
But does the inherent complexity of human injury, especially managing multiple severe problems like in polytrauma, or just the variability we see in human biology, like how differently people respond to training or altitude, does that suggest there might be limits to AI completely replacing human judgment and expertise in medicine?
This is the absolute critical question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
While AI can undoubtedly process data sets far beyond human capacity, complex clinical situations often require really nuanced judgment, adaptability in real time, dealing with the unexpected, integrating factors that go beyond easily quantifiable data points. The human element, empathy, critical thinking, dealing with uncertainty, that hands-on experience with the unpredictable that may remain utterly essential even as AI becomes an incredibly powerful tool assisting clinicians.
And just reflecting on careers in these diverse areas.
The sources offer some pretty standard but solid advice for aspiring professionals, emphasizing the importance of strong academics, getting practical experience through volunteering or internships, networking, specifically mentioning fields like college athletics administration.
And more broadly.
More broadly across the sports industry, the valued skills that come up repeatedly are things like people management, financial literacy, understanding the legal landscape, data analysis skills, of course, and increasingly cultural competence, especially as sport becomes more and more globalized.
Okay. Looking back at everything we've covered now, from the microscopic details of how bone heals to the huge macroeconomic forces driving the sports business, what are some of the most important takeaways for you personally?
For me, I think on the medical side, it's that ongoing shift towards truly valuing patient-reported outcomes. What does the patient say? And the fundamental importance of getting that initial reduction right in trauma surgery, get the bones aligned first.
Right.
And in polytrauma, that nuanced thinking around timing, aiming for definitive fixation around that 36-hour mark, if possible, balancing urgency and stability with the patient's overall physiological state.
Yeah.
Also, just the complexity of the implants themselves, how they actively influence healing, not just passively hold things, how small details matter.
Yeah, interesting. And from the sports performance and business side, what stands out?
The idea that elite performance really is that complex braid of nature and nurture, and how the demands of specific sports are actively shaping athlete body types over time. That's fascinating. And just the sheer scale and sophistication of the sports business ecosystem, how incredibly interconnected media, marketing, finance, facilities all are. Plus, of course, the growing dominance of data everywhere, and that, well, potentially unsettling glimpse into the future intersection of AI and medicine. And maybe most importantly, that ethical behavior isn't just a footnote, it's absolutely fundamental, with really serious consequences when it's ignored.
We've definitely navigated a huge amount of material in this deep dive, linking fields that maybe don't seem obviously connected at first glance.
From fixing catastrophic injuries and understanding the limits of human physical potential, to dissecting the multi-billion-dollar business engine of sport, and even peering into the technological future of both medicine and performance.
If you found this deep dive helpful, maybe insightful, please do consider rating it and perhaps share it with others you think might benefit from exploring these connections too.
And maybe here's something to think about as you go. As data and technology become ever more powerful tools for both healing the human body and pushing its athletic performance to new frontiers, how do we make absolutely sure that the essential human elements, things like empathy, critical judgment, ethical responsibility, how do we ensure they remain the absolute bedrock of both medicine and sport?